Hello and welcome to the Impacts webinar. Thank you for joining us this morning. And we'll be talking about the future of global residential markets. We have an insightful presentation for you and also a panel of experts who are ready to answer a series of questions at the end. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Pleasure to be talking to you this morning. So before we look to the future of global residential markets, we need to look to the past. And we've got 2 decades of data tracking world city prime residential markets. And this chart shows aggregate growth across 30 global cities that we monitor. And since 2008, we've seen significant outperformance of capital values relative to rents in that ultra-low interest rate environment that we've seen in the wake of the global financial crisis. But as interest rates have risen to levels not seen in 15 years, that's now starting to change. So more costly mortgages are muting global sales markets, even in the prime sector. So in the 12 months to June of this year, prime capital values grew by 1.9%, while rents are up by 5.5% amidst a scarcity of supply and would-be buyers turning to rental markets instead. Now, 27 out of the 30 cities that we monitor saw positive rental growth on an annual basis. And that's been led by Lisbon, Singapore, and Dubai. So Lisbon's prime rental market saw a real surge in international demand following the pandemic, and that's fueling growth in their rental markets. Rents are up by more than 30% here on an annual basis. Similar story in Singapore, which has seen growth as businesses move there to some extent at Hong Kong's expense. Now, while average capital growth has slowed, there do remain some outperformers, and it's worth talking about some of those. So at the city level, Dubai saw prime prices rise 19% in the 12 months to June this year. Values are now above their 2014 peak, so some recovery happening there. Conversely, look at the US. Growth has slowed significantly in a number of US cities, notably San Francisco and Los Angeles. The tech slowdown really impacting the former, a new mansion tax, the prime market of the latter. Hong Kong too, seeing relative weakness, so too some mainland Chinese cities, as we've seen that Chinese economic growth story slow. Now, I think it's worth putting recent performance into perspective, and this chart shows prime prices per square foot in US dollars. And while prime prices in Hong Kong are falling, it does remain by far the world's most expensive prime market. Prime prices average $4,000 per square foot in that city. And conversely, in spite of the recent price growth I just talked about, Dubai remains one of the comparatively lower cost prime markets at $800 per square foot, and that implies more room for growth. Now, purchase price isn't the only consideration. Here we have the cost of buying, holding, and selling prime property around the world across our 30 global cities. And this scenario assumes a foreign buyer purchasing a $2 million equivalent property, holding for 5 years, and then sells. No capital growth factored in here, all expressed as a share of property value. Now, a lot of information on this chart, but I think the interesting thing to note here is the cities on the left-hand side, notably Singapore and Hong Kong, who levy particularly high stamp duties on foreign buyers specifically, and that makes total purchase costs in excess of 60% in the case of Singapore. Now, these measures, of course, are designed to cool markets. It also tells us why the likes of Singapore and Hong Kong are actually such big outbound investment markets, particularly when it comes to residential. So we're looking forward. Where next? There's a couple of key factors that will shape the direction of growth in residential markets, both prime but also mainstream markets around the world more broadly. And these are a couple of key areas. So namely the macro environment and, of course, interest rates, spending power, and critically supply. So firstly, the good news is that inflation has now peaked, even in the UK, and that should mean we start to see rates plateau, having risen to recent highs, with some possible rate cuts starting in the US next year. That will start to ease affordability, but it does remain very stretched. Across the OECD, the house price to income ratio remains at levels that we haven't seen since the 1970s, and that's despite falling from recent highs, as you can see on this chart. That's going to continue to mute demand. It's going to push more people to rent, further fueling price growth in the rental sector. Now, in spite of these constraints, there are a number of mitigating factors at play. So firstly, labour markets have remained resilient. We haven't seen the wide-scale job losses that were perhaps expected. Households are less indebted than they were in the past, and because of the prevalence of fixed-rate mortgages, we don't see the impact of those higher rates hitting all at once. Consumer confidence is beginning to return, and finally, and importantly, supply. It remains constrained in both the sales and particularly the rental markets. And for that reason, we expect to see rents continue to outgrow capital values. Even in rental markets, though, affordability constraints will put a ceiling on the rate of that growth going forward. Now, those are the economic drivers. What other trends are we seeing in global residential markets? Well, I'll start with one which is around some interesting shifts we've seen in second home markets, again relating to prime, linked in part to changing patterns of living and working. So the trend of remote or hybrid working was, of course, supercharged during the pandemic. We see this through office utilization figures, which have settled at around 65%, well below that pre-pandemic average, though, of course, there's significant regional variation in that figure. Of course, that implies direct implications for office markets, but it's also shaping residential markets. And just one of the ways we're seeing that play out in the prime segment is the rise of what we term the executive nomad. So this is perhaps a business owner or executive with a flexible role. They're able to work remotely for extended periods of time. And that's starting to turn once seasonal destinations for second homes and living into year-round ones. And recognizing this trend, many locations are actually offering digital nomad visas to attract these very individuals. So we've attempted to assess, what makes an ideal location for this executive nomad, and specifically we assess a location's connectivity, so both digital, clearly internet connectivity is essential, but so too by air, physical connectivity. We look at quality of life, climate, and the location's prime residential rental market. So this is the top 10. It's led by Dubai. The city tops our index for connectivity, both in terms of air, the world's busiest international airport, but also the world's fastest mobile internet, along with other benefits of that city. And indeed, it's no coincidence that the top 5 in this index are cities, but cities that also offer beaches, warm climates, and the benefits of urban living. Also in here that you've got some of those more traditional second home or holiday type locations. So you've got Barbados in 6th, the Algarve in 9th, offering those significant lifestyle advantages. So second home markets continue to evolve. We've tracked it right back to the inception of the second home destination. So this timeline shows the development of global second home destinations over time. So starting with the Côte d'Azur, Lake Como, late 1800s, Hamptons, Palm Beach, through to more European locations emerging as travel opened up from the 60s. And then more recently, you've got a real diversity of locations. You've got more accessible locations adjacent to urban centres, Palm Jumeirah, for example. And one thing that's really driven that is the expansion of wealth, particularly among older generations. And this takes us on to our next future driver, which is demographics. And here I will pass to Kelsey.
Thank you so much, Paul. So last year, the global population reached 8 billion people for the first time ever. India overtook China as the world's most populous country, which is a landmark as China's population actually fell for the first time in 60 years. And while much of the developed world is aging, growth in the developing world means that Generation Z, so those aged between ages 11 and 25, actually became the largest demographic group on Earth. And this shifting demographic trend will shape the future demand for homes, and as well as the nature of these houses across the world. This chart on the screen shows the distribution of the top 100 aged cities in the developed world in 10 years' time. So that's cities with the highest share of over 65s. Now, Germany leads with the largest number of cities, but China is there in second place, followed by Japan, Italy, and France. Looking on the flip side of that, so that's youthful cities in the developed world in 10 years' time, I've highlighted a few on this screen. First, we have cities in the Middle East, including Dubai and Riyadh. Some Chinese cities are also set to remain comparatively youthful. We're including Shenzhen and Guangzhou here. And then there are some youthful hotspots in the West, namely Melbourne, Bristol, and Denver. Now, these are also tech hubs, which are attracting in-migration and spurring economic and population growth. So these opposing demographic trends do have direct implications for the residential markets in the future. An aging world does mean more single-person households. This creates a need for smaller homes, a trend that's also compounded by younger households getting married and having children later. Now, flexible rental models and new types of housing, such as unassisted senior living, can free up real estate for younger generations while also mitigating the epidemic of loneliness among the elderly. Now, Generation Z, more than half of whom are now over the age of 18 and are beginning to enter the workplace as well as occupy their own homes. Now, Generation Z does tend to prioritize travel, convenience, and city living. They're also a very highly mobile generation and have seen the numbers of international students reach new highs. Now, this means an opportunity for student housing and other forms of hybrid living. So this does present a big opportunity. So taking just 2 residential sectors for students and the elderly across 13 global major markets, we estimate that by 2033, we will require 17 million additional care home beds, as well as 18 million additional student housing beds. And now investment into institutional residential already outstrips all other asset classes. After all, everybody needs a place to sleep. And developing specific target markets does ease pressure on the wider residential markets. Supply, as we heard earlier, is the major challenge in most rental markets. So finally, we were going to talk a bit about the environment and how that is affecting the residential markets. Real estate accounts for 40% of global carbon emissions, so it absolutely has to be at the heart of any solutions when it comes to climate change. And given the fragmented ownership of residential property, the challenge for this sector is especially acute. It's widely accepted that much of the global housing stock already existing does not meet current performance standards, and governments are now starting to act. Just to give a few examples, in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act includes tax credits for the installation of solar panels, as well as rebates for heat pumps in residential properties. Canada, you can apply for grants and interest-free loans to improve insulation in the home. Canadian winters require quite a bit of insulation, I've been told. And then in Singapore, the Green Mark scheme certifies a residential building meeting 80% of environmental standards. It also aims to have 80% of the residential stock certified by the end of the decade. So future expansion of government policy, financial incentives will both be key to improving the environmental credentials of residential stock around the world. And climate change also brings challenges directly to our cities as well. New York faces extreme temperatures, flooding, and other natural hazards going forward. And having lived through Hurricane Sandy in 2012, it has since invested heavily in infrastructure and is investing a further $52 billion into flood protections that are already in the works. Cape Town has experienced day zero in 2018 when the city effectively ran out of water. But that led to a number of infrastructure initiatives and strict usage policies. And then finally, after catastrophic wildfires in 2019 and 2020, some Australian states have tightened their building regulations in bushfire-prone regions. Australia's National Construction Code now stipulates fireproof building materials design and construction, as well as insisting on minimum distances between vegetation and buildings. So just to wrap things up, all of this has implications for our residential property now and in the future. Residential markets have slowed as interest rates have risen, and we expect to see improvement over the next year, as well as the continued outperformance of rental markets. Trends in living and working are very much changing the nature of prime second home locations, and responding to different demographic trends around the world will be key. The environment, meanwhile, remains the greatest unsolved challenge and is one that is only just now starting to be addressed. So that is all from World Research this morning. I will now hand you over to Andy for our panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Paul and Kelsey. I mean, there's a lot in there, much food for thought. It's a really interesting time to be part of that kind of residential sector, and there are some challenges, but some exciting opportunities as well. So, just to kind of delve into things a little bit deeper. We have a bit of a Q&A session now with Rich Paul, who's based out of Savills in Dubai, and Mikel Lacheda, who's based out of Savills in Lisbon. So hi Rich, hi Miguel. So just let's kick it off with some some very kind of to the issue questions with regards to Dubai and Lisbon, which really stood out within the presentation. Very strong performances. The market there in both Dubai and Lisbon seem very strong. What's behind that? What's driving that? Miguel, do you want to kick off?
Okay, I kick off. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to say that Lisbon is in international radar market since 8 years, more or less. That will start with attractive tax solutions. And after that, the international market discovered the city, discovered the quality of life, the climate, the security, and stays and talk about it. We have also something that is very important, because we have very competitive prices compared to other European countries. So that is very important. And in this moment, our capital value is around 4 and 5%. Okay. And the rental market is very good because, or the yield of the rental market is very good, high-end rental market, because we don't have, so our rental market is very small. The Portuguese have 70% of the Portuguese are homeowners, so the market of rental is very small. And because of that, and because of the demand that appears, the prices go a little bit up in the high-end market. That's why we have something like 5% of yield in rental market of high-end. That is very good for the residential. Okay, and I think this will continue a little bit. Depends what happens with the inflation and everything. But I think this will stay in the market some years, because we have a problem of lack of construction, of new construction here in Lisbon. We have, in the last 10 years, we have less 10 times the construction than in the other 10 years before. So we have a problem of lack of construction, and that is the way to change the issue.
Okay, thank you. And Rich, same question.
Yeah, I think to sort of understand what we've seen over the last couple of years and some of the performance, you have to take a little step back and understand the context of what happened before that. Prior to COVID, the market had been softening for a good sort of 5 years, normally instilled by oversupply into Dubai. And so, then COVID hit, which probably exacerbated the situation, and values fell again in a short period of time. And therefore, you almost had a bit of a perfect storm, and a market that was naturally ready to rebound anyway, but was now very attractive on a value proposition relative to other cities in the world. You then look at what happened post-COVID, and as Paul described in his presentation, the executive nomad and businesses that realized that they could work out of the Middle East with their staff, there was all of a sudden, in a short period of time, an increase in population, and we saw a 6% growth in population in a very short period of time. And what's important to note is probably the demographic of that population were potential purchasers and renters of mid-market and prime residential. So a lot of ultra high net worth and high net worths came into this market in a quite short period of time, saw what the city had to offer in terms of some of those variables that Paul discussed, in terms of the infrastructure and its connectivity and lifestyle in general. And what Dubai does very well is listen to its population and listen to the world, and adds more things every year to make it even more attractive. And that all culminated in an increase in prices. And rental prices as well as capital. So that's some of the variables and why we've seen such a push and such an aggressive rate hike in the last couple of years.
I was in Dubai a few months ago post COVID, and the place is booming. It was incredible. So just drilling down into that a bit more specifically. So there's huge demand. More and more people working from Dubai or remotely, or move their lives entirely. What types of properties do they want?
Again, it depends on the type of buyer. A lot of people who move here for the first time, clearly they probably don't want to buy straight away. They do want to rent. It depends on what sector you're looking at. At the moment, there is demand across the board, whether it's on the affordable level, whether it's on the mid-level, prime or super prime. There is a market for that. In terms of what's probably the most interesting at the moment is sort of the super prime. As I said earlier, you've got a big glut of ultra high net worths that may have come from cities like New York, London, Paris, and maybe some further Far East, who are used to a certain caliber of property, specification, service, and they are demanding that here. And a couple of years ago, the spec and probably the services that were provided weren't up to scratch, if you're honest. But now, in terms of particularly some of the branded residential property that is coming to the market, they are akin to both on a specification level, but also the services that building provides through the concierge and the rest of it is of a superior level to what before. And that's one of being a real standout preference that we've heard both from developers, but also through sort of stakeholder engagements that we're carrying out in this market, and really understanding what they need and what they're looking for. And it's super interesting.
Sure. Thank you. And Miguel, just with regards to Lisbon again, obviously, as prices rise, affordability becomes more of a challenge. What's the situation in Portugal, in Lisbon? How are things? How's that being tackled?
We have the big issue, as I began, is the problem of offer. We have a very big lack of offer in Lisbon, and because of that, the price is still rising. But in the moment, the prices are slowing a little bit. We have in the last quarter 1% of rising the price in Lisbon in the last quarter. So, but the problem is to see to look at the problem of construction and go forward and start to simplify the construction in Lisbon, and to have to developers have the opportunity to do more new developments. And also the government need to do perhaps some construction for the more needed. So this is the big issue that we have in Lisbon, and I think that will be the way, because I don't believe, or we don't believe in decisions of the government to limit the market, because they are trying to do that and they limit the rental. And what happened with that? The landlords increase the rent until before the law is published. So the effect, it was the opposite that they want. So I think the most important thing is to put supply in the market and let the market work.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I'm really interested to talk a bit more about demographics, because I thought that section of Paul and Kelsey's presentation was really interesting. Now how that's changing things quite substantially. Just focusing on Lisbon for now, because I think Rich touched on things in Dubai. How do you think the demographics of the buyer profile in Lisbon is affecting things? Because it's a youthful city, isn't it? But obviously there's also an aging population.
Yeah, it's a youthful city. we have since, I don't know, but could be 2 or 3 years, we are feeling new trends in our real estate market because of that, and new trends with a lot of demand. Okay, so we have is starting to appear health service residents for the elderly. We have some of that in Lisbon or near Lisbon, in Lisbon region. They are appearing with a lot of demand. And we have also students' residents, and that is a big issue here in Lisbon. We have a lot of developers that now are focusing in student residents because of that, because we have one more time a lack of supply in students' residence also. And it happens also with co-living, but for different reasons, as you know. And again, we will need more construction and to offer good conditions for the youngers to buy. And that is very important because we have a problem now for the youngest Portuguese have difficult to leave their parents' home. And it is very difficult to stay in the center of Lisbon, but I think that is normal in all Europe. But they have that problem. So we need to look at that and to find different conditions for the youngest to have their first home, to buy or to rent.
Indeed. And Rich, obviously you touched on earlier that Dubai works very hard to kind of respond to market demand. There's a real significant demand, isn't there, from a younger demographic in Dubai. Could you talk us a bit more about that and how things there have been adapting to respond to that and make sure that the city is providing what younger people want?
Yeah, I mean, Dubai, I think, has always been a youthful city, and attracted that kind of, well, when I moved here, I was a millennial, but I was sort of mid-20s at the time. I've moved on. And actually, what the problem that they had was actually maintaining that youth. Because of the affordability of the city at different times over the last decade or so, Dubai can price people out if you're not careful, if you want to bring up a family. So it was able to attract the Gen Zs, but then maintaining those is somewhat problematic. So affordability is always something that it's contended with, and that affordability, they've got a lot of levers to pull on. They don't have the restrictions like a lot of countries do in terms of more stringent planning laws. If they want to turn on the tap of supply, they can do with ease. And just a plot now that I'm adjacent to across the road, it's ready. You can buy it tomorrow. You can build G+ Unlimited tower, bigger than the Burj Khalifa if you wish, and you just have to buy it tomorrow. So as a result, when the demand is there, which it is now, you can in terms of new supply and announced projects, you can feed that supply, that demand. Sorry. That's a benefit, but it can also, if you're not careful, be a bit of an issue. And there can be a bit of a boom and bust economy within real estate, particularly residential, if you're not careful in this market. And so, we're always aware of that. And yes, we've come from a good base. On a longer term play, I'm very positive about the region and certainly the UAE and Dubai. There's lots of things going for it, but at the same time, in terms of supply numbers and in terms of launches, there is going to be an awful lot hitting our market over the next year, 2-3 years, and that will undoubtedly soften things up, and you will start to see rents coming down at a certain point, I imagine, particularly when some of the inventory and topologies that aren't available in the market right now start coming. So you got to be careful that yes, they can ramp up supply and as I say, feed that demand, but they can get a little too ahead of themselves and then it will soften. But I think the general longer term play is that there's lots going for the region and certainly for the UAE and Dubai.
Sure. And finally, we can't not touch on very quickly your thoughts on some of these giga projects that are kind of coming forward over the next kind of few years. You and I are kind of working closely on those. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean it's a massive opportunity as Saudi Arabia try and reinvent their nation, not just for the domestic market there and for the younger population, but also the world. And some of the projects they're working on are vast and game changing. And in time, international investors will have to start looking at it. They are building residential or they're building all manner of different real estate inventory and classes, but real estate resi that will accommodate a younger population that want to probably see what's going on across the pond in the UAE and in other parts of the world, and they've traveled more and they want that type of more contemporary living than they've been used to. And so there's a big demand there and an opportunity, but also maybe more so on the west coast of Saudi Arabia and what they're doing along the Red Sea. That's going to be a massive second home and holiday home opportunity, not just for ultra high net worths, but also for investors as well. So, lots to look at after the coming years, and we're thrilled to be involved in them.
Absolutely, we've all got some busy times ahead for sure. Well, listen, thank you, Rich. Thank you, Miguel. Thanks to Kelsey and Paul as well. Thanks to our panel. Thanks to everybody for watching. We'll see you soon.